Well, hello, everybody there. Thank you very much indeed to Dan, to Earthscan, for inviting me to participate and indeed kick off this discussion of Copenhagen. And it was clearly a pretty dramatic event, and one of the follow-on dramas is that there are very different views as to what happened and even whether it's considered success, dismal failure, or other kind of outcome. What I thought would be useful would be if I said a few words about the run-up to Copenhagen, then a bit about the process, and then something about the Copenhagen Accord that emerged, necessarily or very briefly. I then want to offer a few observations on how it's been seen in different parts of the world and some personal thoughts about ways forward. The key points about the run-up to Copenhagen. First is to acknowledge it's set against a long diplomatic backdrop, of which the most specific event was the Bali conference 2 years earlier, which launched the Bali Action Plan. Something which one read through it, I found myself describing as the most complicated set of negotiations in history. I confess at the time I wondered if it would be possible to conclude such an enormous agenda successfully in only 2 years. Particularly against the backdrop, of course, that all eyes really focus on the United States and the new administration, which really only had a few months to get a team together to determine a position it tabled in the summer, which really proposed a new way of approaching international architecture based on a bottom-up acknowledgement of what countries felt they could deliver given their domestic political processes, and also its need seen as central in the US political discourse to have China on a comparable legal footing. I'm not sure that people fully appreciated the significance of that US position. We may well come back to that. I think from that point it's fair to say there wasn't much shift in anybody's position until the last quarter of 2009. The European Union announced at Bangkok that they were in favour of a single unified structure, while stressing that, which implied clearly moving away from the existing Kyoto Protocol, while stressing they wanted to maintain its core features of internationally binding national emission constraints. That in turn attracted some pretty serious backlash from developing countries, not least saying that in their views that represented an attempt to weaken the legal nature of commitments on industrialized countries. At the same time, clearly the industrial world was pushing for much stronger action from developing countries. That was not a happy occasion at the Barcelona negotiations 1 month before Copenhagen. All of that fed into, I think, and confirmed an emerging view that there was no prospect really of a legally binding treaty emerging at Copenhagen. The differences were simply too large. Now, that high-level drama, of course, did obscure the fact that many people on some of the sub-elements, and most of all, I think, the RED's discussions on deforestation, were much more optimistic about some of those components. And all along underlying that, there was strong emphasis upon financing, in particular, perhaps, for adaptation, also, of course, for mitigation. If we now move on to what then happened in process terms at Copenhagen itself, and one of the interesting questions for people to reflect is how much did the process contribute to the outcome, or were simply the barriers too high? But it certainly didn't help that against that long backdrop, there was a lot of suspicion generated. There was a leak of a draft political text in the first week, to which some would say, of course, the host country, the presidency, was trying to fashion various ways out of the box, but it certainly didn't go down very well. The UN negotiations continued through into the beginning of the second week, with the twin-track negotiations reflecting both the Kyoto track, formally to define industrialized country commitments post-CAPS, post-2012, which is not including the US, and the global discussions under the LCA, the long-term cooperative action track, which was the jargon effectively for the Bali Action Plan of global negotiations. And I think the struggle between those two tracks impeded some of the progress on the components, but it's also very hard, and there's been criticism the UN proved itself unable to reach agreement. Of course, no one's going to strike a deal on the toughest things when they know their heads of state are about to resolve. The heads of state are supposed to come in and try and address the toughest issues. That said, it was clearly not easy as the ministers arrived. Connie Hildegard, who, whatever one says, had spent an immense amount of effort understanding the issues, was moved aside to make way for the Danish Prime Minister as chair. And 120 or so heads of state, I think, were many of them wandering around the corridors, wondering quite why they'd come. It wasn't entirely clear. There wasn't a clear plan as to exactly what the role of heads of state would be. When there's so many, you clearly cannot have real negotiations without numbers. You need things prepared to a far better extent than was actually the case. Now, on the Friday morning even, people were referring to a very ugly mood. In many capitals, the negotiators were preparing briefing notes on a complete failure. What emerged was much more interesting than that. We move to the next slide. There will probably be many different versions forever of quite what happened on Friday and who would claim credit and blame. But it's entirely clear that the arrival of President Obama was, everybody was watching. His statement attracted diverse reactions. Many feared it was seen as a bit inflammatory with its references to transparency. There were dramatic scenes as President Obama engaged with the key developing countries directly and crafted Copenhagen Accord with also the basic group, the Brazil, South Africa, India, China group that had been discussing, and President Obama, with having had some obviously consultation with the EU and Japan, arrived, pushed through those, and pushed through the Copenhagen Accord with some limited outreach to others, an expanded group around 20 to 25 countries, then engaged in consultation, and President Obama then announcing success before having to depart. Now, one thing that is perhaps less visible to some of the audience in the US is what then happened, that in effect the rest of the world in the Conference of Parties felt they were presented with a fait accompli. We saw for the first time a new group, ALBA, I've already Brazil, Cuba, Venezuela, flexing its muscles as a blocking group. A little commented role from Ban Ki-moon, which rescued a measure of global endorsement by the Conference of Parties for the Copenhagen Accord, but in rather unusual ways. It needn't really take up our time. It is worth noting that it has left a degree of ill feeling to be overcome and a degree of debate about the nature, the issues, the problems of the UN process and the relationship of the Copenhagen Accord to those processes.